Welcome to today's TeamTalks event. Let me just check who has been on one of the TeamTalks events so far. It's the third one, so a few people, that's good. For all the others, TeamTalks, our event series, is basically about, I would say, the community, about content. So we would like to engage with you, discuss with you, find interesting topics we can present, find interesting speakers who would like to present. And of course, it's a community. We are always happy if you also propose a technology, a topic, something which is really interesting for you, so we can check if we find a speaker, or if you want to speak on your own, just let us know. And before starting with today's topic, I already want to announce the next TeamTalks event. It's on 25th of June, one day before our K15t solution forum. The topic of the TeamTalks haven't been decided. Maybe we get some of our keynote speakers from the solution forum, so we still have to figure it out. And if you're interested to learn about like a full day about Atlassian tools and solutions, technical talks and workshops, maybe also consider visiting the solution forum on 26th. It's a whole day event for free. So today TeamTalks is about software documentation. On the one hand, we will talk about API docs or Open API, and we will also talk about ASCII Doctor. The first talk in this case, and we had to reschedule a little bit because after the talk, unfortunately, I have to go home because I'm not feeling very good. I will start with the API docs talk, and after every of the talks we will do a little or a small Q&A session, and as there's pizza and drinks afterwards, we're still sticking to the ASCII notation here. So there's enough time to chat, to talk about basically the talks or anything you're interested in. Okay. So let's start. Today I want to talk about API docs, why they are important and why we should invest more time developing them or writing them. And this talk is motivated by my own personal or our personal situation. I think we have pretty good product docs. However, when talking about API docs, yeah, I think there's room for improvement. So everything I will tell you today is basically based on recent research and experiments I did after the last team talk with Open API and some technologies to find out what we could improve in our stack. And we will learn about a different stack later on. So my talk is basically structured. I will talk a little bit about API economy, discoverability, Open API and Swagger tools as a standard, show you the simple proof of concept I came up to solve hopefully our issue, and a short wrap-up, a summary. So why are API docs important at all? I mean, if I start now talking about microservices or loosely coupled architectures, everybody will say, whoa, that's an old story. Please tell me something new. And actually, I mean, this trend from the monolithic applications to smaller services which can be reused inside the enterprise already happened years ago. And the recent trend is more that more and more of those services which you were running in-house are shifted to existing services of platforms which grow in the internet like crazy, which provide specialized functionality you can use at a low cost and with interfaces which just work cross-product. So there's a whole industry around it, and there's a lot revenue through API. The number of services which offer APIs is growing constantly, and a lot of companies are really generating most of their revenue just with offering public APIs. One number I found is that there are more than 19,000 public APIs out there, so not like single operations like a get, post, put, or whatever, real services. So imagine what people must have developed to get to this number. And one of the really famous examples although it's not just services we would use in a software, but also the platforms, the hosting, and everything else is definitely Amazon, where AWS and all their offerings and services make a huge percentage of their revenue. I'm not sure if they already reached the revenue of their marketplace. I mean, this is a really big player, but also other services like Stripe. So if you want to build a software platform which is running an internet business and needs online payments, Stripe is one of those providers which allow you to come up with a marketplace, with a subscription service, dealing with all the canceling just because they offer the right API for you. Or there's Twilio. So software teams use the Twilio APIs to build capabilities like voice, audio, video, and messaging into their applications. And if you ever used Lyft, Netflix, or probably Airbnb, you also use Twilio. Same applies to Stripe. So these are more the classical software companies offering their APIs. But there are other companies like Airbnb. I would never thought about, hey, they have to document API, but yes, they do. Because a lot of their revenue, or more than half of their revenue, comes from their affiliate programs. So they have an API which allows anybody to integrate, where's the next hotel in San Francisco, services to find nice spots in Airbnb and then do the booking and everything through the API. So Airbnb has a huge public API, not actually public affiliate API documentation. So the big question is, if there's so many players around and huge services, how can we find them? How do we know that they exist? And actually the answer is pretty simple. Yeah, we have to search for such services in the internet, and thus the answer is documentation. So no matter if it's just product docs, service docs, or API docs, all of those documentations have been written in a good way so that people can consume and understand what the use case is and how to apply product, service, or APIs. And the ingredients for good documentation actually don't differ that much. So no matter which docs you're writing, you should always know your customer. So which target audience are you writing the content for? Because you have to write for them. You should use active voice. You should speak as they speak. You should always tell a story. So why is your product, your service, your API offering the right for them? Why should they use it? You should always start basic, because you can get advanced later on, and you have to imagine that people start with a beginner level and need to improve over time and learn. Always provide examples. So give users an entry point. Let them find themselves in your examples, in the use cases you provide, so they can imagine how to use that service in their own environment or product in their own environment. Provide ways to give feedback and listen to that feedback carefully, because is something missing in your API? Is your product missing a feature? You explained something, although the functionality is there, nobody gets it. So if you listen to your customers and listen to the feedback, you can improve a lot. And really important, there's nothing more embarrassing than reading a doc which isn't up to date. So really care about keeping your docs up to date. And these ingredients apply for all kind of documentation. If we think about API documentation, so yeah, developers are your customers, sure. So you have to realize that they're really new to your API. Maybe they know roughly what is the service doing. So I know roughly what Twilio is doing, but I never use the API. So I would need to learn that from scratch. So it's really important to provide a good overview and the basic knowledge first, and then get into the advanced topics. And provide examples which can be simply applied. So authentication is always a big topic. if your service requires an OAuth2-based authentication, you should explain how to do it, how users can authenticate with your API before you let them do the first GET or POST request where they need to know about that, and they're just failing because authentication didn't work. So start with the basics and build on top so they learn more about the functionality. And Google is doing a pretty good job there for at least the Google Docs API documentation. So they start with concepts first. So you know about what is a document, what's the basic structure, you learn about all the terminology you need to know to understand their docs later on. They have a quick start guide for different programming languages and frameworks, which allow you to easily set up and run your first code against their API. And they have the how-to section where you can see create and manage documents. Yeah, actually that's, I think, the first use case somebody will have, because if you can't create a document, how would you manipulate it later on? And then it's really about merging text, formatting text, what the user is looking for, and they describe it in a really good way. So knowing all about how I should build my documentation and the ingredients and what I should look for me the question was, isn't there a standard I can just use? And for me the answer was yes. There's OpenAPI. And as APIs are more or less forming a connecting glue between all of our modern applications, at least when you're like developing in this cloud-based world than we do, APIs are everywhere. And so it's really important to have a vendor-neutral and open format which is portable and a standard you can rely on. So there is OpenAPI, and the terms which you will usually read when searching for it, it's the OAS, that's the specification part, and the OAI, which is the initiative behind it. The consortium which basically came up with the specification, which is Google, Microsoft, Atlassian, and much more companies. And there's one really special and specific company called SmartBear or SmartBear. You know them if you ever used SoapUI or maybe Zephyr for testing, because they own all of those products. And they invented years ago Swagger. It was an open source framework to specify your APIs and a lot of tools to really work with the specification. And they contributed this whole specification to the initiative. So what today is OpenAPI was earlier Swagger. So if somebody's mixing up the terms, which usually happens, that's the reason why. So what is that specification? The OpenAPI specification is a specification for REST APIs. So you can't use it for Java docs. When I read about it, this small piece, it's for REST APIs. I detected it very late. I thought, wait, the holy grail. Cool, we apply it to everything. But no, it's just for REST APIs. But it's fine in our use case. And an OpenAPI file specification allows you to describe all of your available endpoints, the operations, the inputs, the outputs, the authentication methods, additional information such as licensing, and so on. And these specifications are written in YAML or JSON, human and machine readable. Yes, you can read it, but I wouldn't say it's the best human readable experience, but it's okay. And there are a lot of tools out there, especially the Swagger tools, which will help you and drive your experience using that specification further. So when we start with OpenAPI, we have two decisions. Either we write from scratch. They call it definition first. So you have to write the descriptor file first before doing the coding. So think before writing, it's always a good idea, right? So another benefit, if you first specify or define the specification, the description, you can get feedback really early in the process. You can hand over the specification, ask your potential customers or people who would use your service, other developers, and check if the API is really providing all the functionality they need. You get feedback, you can apply changes before you go into development. And if your specification is ready, you could have, for example, 2 teams, say, hey, here's the specification, please start writing the test scenarios and tests, please implement my backend service and everything I need, and later on everything comes together and you might save time. Furthermore, the Swagger tools allow you to create stubs from those definitions, so you might also save some time coding later on. But reality usually looks different. So there's also the generate from code first approach. And that's the approach which is more interesting to me or us in our scenario, because we have existing services, we have existing APIs. Actually, they were supposed to be private APIs we use in our front end, but customers, of course, Google, if you use Chrome or Firefox, you open the console, check the network tab, see all the XHR requests, and then voila, your private API gets more or less a public API in that scenario. People start using it and you run into problems, especially if it's not well documented. So what I was looking for is to generate that specification file format from our existing code base. And the good thing is, if you are using JAX-RS, you actually don't need to have to do that much, because there are tools out there which already create a specification. It's a specification which lacks a lot of information. I mean, operations, method names, parameters, everything is in there, but if you want to extend it, add descriptions, summaries, and a little bit more descriptive text, you will need to use annotations, which are provided by the Swagger, respectively, OpenAPI stack. So, I'm always mentioning Swagger. So there's the Swagger editor, the Swagger UI, Swagger CodeGen, Swagger Core, Swagger Hub, a whole bunch of Swagger tools. Most of them are open source. Some of them, as the Hub, is commercial. The Swagger editor is basically a web-based editor which supports you in writing your JSON or YAML description files and also provides validation. You can then use the Swagger UI component to render an interactive experience of that documentation. So people click through the methods, see what parameters are supported, expected, if you need to authenticate or not. And another nice thing is, if you set it up correctly and provided a server URL, people could really run live requests against your service. I would disable that in the documentation, because I think you can also use Postman and import that specification file to do that, but that's a different story. So, beside the editor and the UI, there's the CodeGen part, which has a lot of different tools to generate server stubs and libraries you can just use and start coding. And the API and core package are basically there to support you in your builds, in keeping or integrating your docs directly, your specifications directly into documentation, and annotate existing code to enrich the information of your service. And Swagger Hub, it's a commercial platform, basically bundling everything, plus providing additional features like the enterprise level features for user and project management, integrations with Git, so you can load your specifications file from Git or persist it to Git, and bringing together a whole tool suite for API documentation. And referring to a smart bear, and in this case, like Swagger questionnaire, they say 69% of organizations already use the Open API specification in the API development. I'm not sure about that number because it always depends who you have asked, but what I found really interesting here, there were 15% who are not using any API standard. And I would say, yeah, we are one of these, and we would like to change that. Furthermore, they asked if you're really happy and feeling confident with your documentation. And only 35% said, yes, we are above average, we have a really good documentation. And I would say for our product docs, I would also say we are above average. But for API docs, what we documented so far was using tables, putting in the request URL, maybe trying to describe parameters, but it wasn't really good. So definitely there's room for improvement. So we are part of these 26%. So my goal was, in kind of researching this topic a little bit, to come up with some small improvements we can directly implement in the product and improve on over the time. So I thought it would be good to use Swagger and try to integrate it into our existing docs during build time. So in our case, because our whole REST APIs were already JAX RS based, it was pretty simple to lift the code first approach, because everything could be loaded and parsed from those JAX RS files, and only if I needed some additional information I used Swagger specific annotations. In my Maven file, I had to integrate 3 dependencies to the annotations, to the JAX RS2 basically required for the frame, for the parser, and a new dependency. Actually, it's not required in this case, but we were using an older version of JAX RS, and we had to use 2.1 because of an updated interface or new interface, and a plugin which was executed in compile phase, which really then parsed our REST resources and generated the OpenAPI JSON format. So in our case, because we specified a resource package, everything was parsed automatically. But in other setups, the minimum requirement of annotations you need to have on a resource to get it parsed correctly is an @API annotation and the path annotation of the JAX RS service. So if you look at a resource as example, we have the path to our REST endpoint called example. The API annotation with a value example basically tags that API. So you will see it later on what this means. And our resource produces application JSON XML. And you can override those values then on the operation level later on. So one of our methods or operations was find example by topic, returning the regular JavaX response object that's kind of required. So, and it's unrelated to the response I mentioned above. So it was a get operation available under /find by topic. And using the API operation annotation, I was able to define more semantic or describe it a little bit better. The value is basically a summary, really a short statement, and the notes is later on parsed as description, where you can really add some text. The response, it's really interesting because I don't know what response is, of what type is response. If I just have a look at this API definition, I don't know. With the annotation, I can see, oh, we're returning something from example class, an instantiation. And the response container allows me to say, actually, it's not just like a single instance, it's a list. And using that information, I think already using it just internally without generating anything for the outside, me as a developer, this would help, definitely. So after parsing, that's the part of the OpenAPI JSON we receive. So we see that the path of the class and the method was combined. It's a get method with the tag example. The value was transformed in the summary and the node to a description. And we get the information then if this request is successful, returning 200, that something of type array with example items is returned. And if this example class would have additional annotations, this could be parsed again, and you will also have the JSON format description for that example class. So my simple approach to make our docs a little bit better was to incorporate what we just seen in our Maven build process. Whenever we build a release, it's tagged in Bitbucket. We're using Bitbucket as a Git repository. And whenever we receive like this tag event, we execute a pipeline in Bitbucket, which then does the whole Maven build again. In this case, just to generate the OpenAPI JSON. And then we use that OpenAPI JSON to make a call to Confluence where we write our docs and kind of push it. In this case, we're creating a new page for a provided version we retrieve from the tag name and provision or push in the content from the JSON format in an OpenAPI macro, which then eventually renders the Swagger UI. And combining that with our versioning and the viewport, it basically looks like that to the customer. So these are our different products. We go to scroll versions, and somewhere there's the section beside our regular user docs using REST API with scroll versions. You get a short introduction to the basics like authentication, which is really important. And then the macro is basically rendering the Swagger UI. So we have that interactive component for our APIs, and in the backend, the corresponding JSON format for it. So that's already the story and my research I wanted to talk about. And for me, the summary is actually the better your API is documented, the more developers will be able to integrate with it, right? And the more they integrate with it, the more your solution, in this case our product, is coupled with their product. And so our product gets a key service for them, which means, yeah, and that's the business side again, it's more likely that they will renew our service. So that's why it makes sense to invest in that for us as well. That's it. Thanks. So are there any questions before I hand over to Andres?
So how long do the texts get if you write text into your Java code in an attribute? How long do they tend to get? Because I mean, if you really want to document your API and you want to make sure that you provide some examples of how to use it or not to use it and what to expect, I imagine that it gets quite lengthy. Do you have some examples or some advice on that? Or?
So the good thing with the Swagger UI, just open a picture above is, where have we had a picture? Here. So, now. So the good thing for this one, and it's really just, in this case, first on the API level, you get all the details when you expand your method. So it doesn't blow up your document at once, but as soon as you write a whole essay in there, I think it's nice to get some information, but if you really want to write an essay and provide code examples and talk more, I would just use the regular mechanism. So in our case, in Confluence, I would just create a new documentation page using a code macro, embed something and describe the services. And this is really more for the interactive part where I want to describe the whole data model of my response values or the inputs I require. So I think, at least in my opinion right now, just using this representation of the UI doesn't solve the problem completely. So it's always a combination of regular docs together with this. So just providing that UI wouldn't solve our issue. I mean, that's also why we described authentication and some of the concepts before. And it's up to you then how fine-grained you would like to do that. You can also just render a small piece out of that Swagger file, or with the tags later on filter it and split it up. So I would still use and write regular description and examples there. It's just a nice method to interactively provide parts of the UI and explore it, and maybe with the option to directly execute statements from there. It's also nice, but it's not just a solution for its own, which solves everything.
So it means you would rather put a hyperlink into the code tag where the actual conference page.
For example, yes. Or have a conference page, you browse through that, and then just include a small chunk of the service in that part of the docs. Yeah. Anybody else?
Is that, oh sorry.
Do you have any experience with API versioning? Like let's say you generated document API version 1, and for like a month later on, one specific endpoint change the response structure.
Yeah.
And how do you manage it? You roll out a new API versioning, or?
So as we combine it, or I would like to combine it with our user docs, what you can see in the upper right corner, we have a version picker there, because for every product version we release an end user documentation, which is version, so all the changes are tracked there. And using that mechanism, we basically, for every new version, we just replace the open API spec there. So it's implicitly versioned and the user can switch. If you're running a software as a service, then you always have the latest, then it doesn't really matter. But in our case, this JSON files would be automatically versioned with the product docs. And because we generate it in the build and push it to the docs there, we make sure that also the latest doc version has the latest API and they are really in sync and up to date. Christoph?
Yeah, in the end, like if you're changing a lot, then the version will be grow like that. So do you have like normally timeline like 1 month roll out one versioning? Or?
Yeah, okay, maybe then it's really special. So in our case, our versions we release, I would say, once a month. So yeah, our version history is growing, but I mean our system, it doesn't matter how many versions we provide there. The user, I mean, in our case, users install our apps as kind of plugins into their Confluence or Jira environment to add certain functionality. And that's why we have to make sure that all of those versions we ever delivered to the marketplace are still documented and available, because we can't force them to upgrade to any version. So if we end up with 60 versions in that picker or more, that's how it is. We have an end-of-life policy, so maybe at some point in time we just remove the versions from the docs, but that's nothing we really care about. So if we have a new release, some artifacts a customer could potentially deploy, there's a documentation for it. Yeah.
Every release has their own unique.
Yeah.
To expand on the first question, did you find any best practices, like to break down the documentation, so not being written in your Java code, because it might get pretty messy and a lot of content?
No, not yet. I was just looking in, because also a customer asked for these files for our APIs. I was looking into that and looking how to integrate it here. I think that's a nice part of Andres' talk maybe, because he's really showing how you can reference snippets or parts of your code in your documentation. And although I guess we won't do it with ASCII-Doctor later on, that's something I will explore in the future. As I said, that's just a small improvement starts. And like in my daily business, I will continue improving it. And yeah, hopefully we have a good solution at the end. But it's a good start.